Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Anthony Joshua. It was a bad night at the office for sure against Daniel Dubois. So what now? What next? And is this fight a bit of a precursor of more of what's to come in his career? Was it an off night? Is he showing symptoms of decline in his career? Or can he bounce back? And it's the heavyweight division, so styles make fights and all that. So Joshua against different fighters could perform much better. But that fight with Daniel Dubois was always going to be risky with Dubois' punching power. And I said ahead of the fight, I thought that the power was being overlooked. Daniel Dubois' chance in that fight slightly being underestimated, and I guess so it proved. But Joshua, he didn't look right from the off. I think one thing that concerned me ahead of the fight after the weigh-in was the weight. Joshua was 252 and a quarter pounds for this one. I thought that's going to make it hard to do the sort of keep it long, box and move, sort of the strategy that he had for the Usyk fights. That version of Joshua around 240 to 244 pounds, who could pop the jab, who could move, who could get in and out a lot more easier than a Joshua at 250 odd pounds. And actually Joshua for the past 5 fights has been at 250 plus pounds. He was 255 for Jermaine Franklin and all in between for the other ones against Ngannou, Wallin, Helenius and now Daniel Dubois. And I know it's something that some people have not liked me saying, that, you know, they'll say, oh, a few pounds doesn't make a difference, but against certain fighters, if you want to do certain strategies, it makes all the difference. We sometimes see fighters losing 10, 15 pounds trying to be much more light on their feet. And I think Joshua, he did look like he was slower in there. Not just with his feet, but also the hands. He didn't look as sharp. And I think that could be a direct correlation between how he came into this fight. And Ben Davison after the fight said, look, I've had a lot of credit in recent fights for some of what's happened with Joshua. It's a loss now. I deserve some of the blame. So, I mean, my question is, well, what was the strategy? Because Ben Davison said, look, I was giving instruction. He just couldn't follow them. Some of that was down to what was happening in the fight. And I think there is a part of that with Joshua not able to respond, because effectively after the first round, the end of that first round when he was dropped, his legs were gone, and obviously the second round and after that, he started to take more shots, and it was very hard for him to get back into the fight. Ultimately stopped in the 5th round. But in that first round, I think a Joshua at 252 pounds, we saw a fighter that wasn't as fleet of foot. And against a guy in Daniel Dubois who you knew what he was going to do, trying to fight at the mid-range and trade with him was always going to be a risky strategy, given the puncher that Dubois is, and especially that Joshua hasn't fought a lot of big punches in recent times. And I'm not really counting Francis Ngannou because he's an MMA fighter. Robert Helenius did have power, but he's washed as anything, and he was a late replacement. So the question of the off night, it could possibly be an off night. Maybe camp didn't go as well as they wanted. Maybe if they could get it back again, they would go, well, our strategy or what we were looking to do didn't quite work. And it was hard to see what they were trying to do, because Joshua never really sort of seemed to settle on what he wanted to do. It sort of seemed to be the feeling out process. He was reacting to a lot of what Dubois was doing. Dubois was executing what he wanted to do, and Joshua was responding. Perhaps that first round, the feeling out process, just never allowed him to get into the rhythm to do what he wanted to do in this fight. Very possible. So there is the possibility it was just an off night, but I think a lot of people saw that performance, saw what happened, and thought Joshua with his hands down, no defense, seemingly always in range of Daniel Dubois' power jab and getting clipped with a lot of right hands and left hooks as the fight wore on, that it was a Joshua that they weren't used to seeing. That other versions of Joshua in other fights would have done a much more responsible job on the defensive end. Perhaps some of that was the reacting to what had happened and he was just in survival mode. But even from the off, I don't think it was a Joshua that looked quite right. He didn't quite perform. But is that symptomatic of a decline? Well, it could be. I mean, Joshua has been an amateur and then a pro for quite a long time now. 34 years old, quite a lot of miles on the clock now, as they say. He does have very long training camps, so he does put his body through a lot of rigors, for the purpose of his sport and preparing for his high-level fights. So it could be that Joshua is just lost his edge. And I have said in different videos over a period of time, especially on Patreon, that I do think that the promoters are trying to eke every last cent and promotional value out of Joshua, Fury, Usyk and Wilder. And we're seeing maybe the end of that. And I've said that as part of that, some of these guys, I don't think that they're actually all of them, I don't think they're at their absolute peaks anymore. I do think that there has been a point where they're sliding off their best and they're maybe a bit past prime. Doesn't mean they're not very good heavyweights. And that's the thing people confuse when you say that someone's not at their absolute peak. There's always going to be, in your career, a zenith point. I think Joshua probably, along with these other guys, has passed that. But part of what their promoters in Riyadh season with Turkey, etc., they want to maximize the value out of these guys in the next couple of years before they're gone. Because when you look under the hood and what's coming under, there hasn't been as much development and pushing of some of the fighters under them to build that next level of star. Obviously, over time, that'll happen to some extent. But we have been in a period where you've had huge names like Joshua, Wilder, Fury, and more recently Usyk coming up to heavyweight division and sort of tearing a hole through it. These guys have been huge names in what we can consider a golden age. So do I think Joshua is at his absolute best? Probably not. And that fight could have been indicative of it. Maybe, you could say that they got the strategy a little bit wrong. Maybe he should have come in 5 or 10 pounds lighter. It's all in hindsight now. But Joshua, can we expect similar performances in future fights? A lot will depend on matchmaking as well. As we saw against Francis Ngannou, he looked $1 million, but against a huge puncher in Daniel Dubois, they were always going to have a strategy that tried to negate some of what he tries to do. And given, he is prone to, when he gets hurt, stays hit. I always thought, and this was part of my preview coverage, that he needed to keep it long and really use his legs, use his boxing ability to outmaneuver Daniel Dubois. We didn't really see that. So can he still do that? Well, I guess when you look at his most recent fights coming in at 250 pounds, it would suggest that they think that his best weight is around 250 to 255. Perhaps it's a hat tip as well to, at this stage in his career, maybe that's where he's most comfortable. He doesn't want to go below that for whatever reason. But the what next is interesting because obviously we do have a situation with Joshua having a rematch clause. And I know some people have been up in arms about it because this is considered a mandatory challenge. This is Daniel Dubois beating the challenger. He was holding the belt, but Joshua, as the promotional A side, negotiated a rematch. Whether the IBF is going to respect that or not, we shall see. But I guess Dubois is free to do what he wants to do. And that could include the rematch. And given the performance against Joshua, he will fancy himself all day, every day, to beat Joshua from here on out. Not only is it sparring stories anymore, it's a huge knockout in the ring in front of more than 90,000 fans. Actually, the official attendance updated to 98,000, so updated from 96,000, which was announced on the night. Turkey coming out after the fact saying 98,000. So, yeah, I think Dubois, he would take it. But when would that be? Because they're saying Dubois wants to be out by the end of the year. And I think activity for Dubois has been his friend. Joshua probably wants a little bit of time out. Probably the earliest we see him is February or March. Maybe Dubois will not be happy with that. But if he has to abide by a rematch clause, Joshua will probably have the fight, in time, probably in about 6 months. And I guess what we saw in that, mentally, if he exercises the rematch clause, mentally, I think it's going to be quite tough. He's now got 4 losses. He's lost in all manner of ways in the heavyweight division. And a loss doesn't spell the end of your career, and people are saying he should retire. We saw what Joshua did after the Ruiz loss. He came back, he boxed, a long-range fight. But this is a different kettle of fish, a different style of fighter who's much closer to Joshua's height and overall dimensions. But he's got to be smarter in a rematch. And I was surprised they weren't more cagey, more cautious, more sort of keeping it long. Joe Joyce was able to beat Dubois with a jab by circling. Obviously, Dubois and Joyce, that was 4 years ago. Dubois is better now. But Joshua, he does have some of the tools and the skills to implement a strategy which can work. But obviously, a big part of the game, we know, is a mental game here. Joshua, if he doesn't face Dubois, I've heard the name Deontay Wilder mentioned. I think we're past that at this point. But I guess I wouldn't mind seeing it, and if the Saudis want to pay for it to happen. But I guess both guys probably should expect a haircut on the money. This isn't 2018 or 2019. It's probably, there's not the demand that there once was. It's not an undisputed fight. It won't be for a title. But I guess it's a fight, if we don't get it, it's one of these fights of the generation that will kind of kick ourselves that we didn't. Maybe we're not kicking ourselves at the moment as hard as we would have a few years ago, and they're both looking maybe a little bit damaged at this point. But if it happens, okay. But I don't think that Joshua should be going into some mega rebuild, because what's the point? 34 years old, the fights are here and now. There is more of a UFC type mentality developing with Riyadh season, the Saudis basically wanting all the big names to continue fighting big names. And I applaud them for that, because we want that. I don't want to see Joshua drop down and face guys that are top 30, top 40, where he's going to win. There is no real challenge. It's just really keeping him busy and active until he eventually fights in a big fight. Maybe mentally he needs it though. But I would like to see Joshua, if he's not in the rematch, still face a decent name. He can still be in big fights. Certain style matchups will be good for him. He's still a big puncher in the heavyweight division. As we know, that can change fights. That can turn people's lights out. And he's got more than the tools to do that against certain guys. Daniel Dubois for the rematch, certainly a question mark if he can overhaul Daniel Dubois. It's not impossible, but I don't think he should retire. But at the same time, there are question marks about, was it really an off night, or is this more symptomatic of a decline? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.